You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How goes it?
Good. How are you?
I'm ready to go back on some mold jobs. I'm tired of doing course creations. And
yeah, you don't like the digital content creation very much.
I hate it, actually. Just so our listeners know that. It's on record.
Yes.
I'm not a computer guy. So anyhow, today, speaking of mold remediation, today's topic is hiring the proper company for toxic mold remediation. You obviously hear all this stuff that I usually have to deal with, but why do you think we're going to talk about it?
Because so many people come to you who have hired the wrong person, who have spent thousands and thousands and thousands with the wrong company.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's like $40,000, $50,000.
Yeah, and that's not even the testing cost.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. As our listeners probably know, mold is, as far as new business owners, mold's kind of the new fad, I think.
Oh, yeah.
That's probably not the right way to say that, but...
Yeah, it's the new shiny business to start.
Yeah, I know in Utah, there's a new restoration company every time you turn around, and, companies can buy franchises and all that kind of stuff. So I want to start with this, though. For our listeners, when should you bring in the mold remediation company? Like, should they always bring them in? Is there a certain amount of mold? What would you think?
Well, as soon as you suspect you have a mold problem, you should bring them in.
I agree. But per our certification standards, and per the EPA, if it is smaller than 10 square feet, they can do it themselves.
Oh, okay.
Would you suggest anybody trying to do it?
Because mold is toxic in general.
Exactly.
And can be more toxic even if it's allergenic mold, depending on who's in the household. So it all depends.
Yeah. And on top of that, our listeners have heard me say this 100 times. I don't believe I've ever done, and I've been doing mold remediation for 15 years probably at this point. I've never done a mold remediation project that only entailed what we thought it was going to entail, meaning our scope of work was always more than what the original scope was.
Correct.
Plus, on top of that, most homeowners are not going to have the equipment. They're not going to have the knowledge. They can go look up the IICRC standards, but they're not going to know how to do it properly. They're probably not going to have the proper containments. I mean, there's just a lot of factors.
Oh, absolutely. Hiring an expert makes the most sense.
Yeah. And, even if, let's say we have a listener and they're like, well, we don't have a whole lot of money. We have enough that maybe we could just hire an IEP to, maybe write the scope of work. I guess my point is if you're a listener and you think you're going to have your husband or your uncle or brother who's a contractor do it, at least hire an IEP to create your scope of work.
And what does IEP stand for again?
Indoor Environmental Professional.
So any indoor environmental professional they should hire to at least create the scope of work.
Yeah, and we've talked about IEPs obviously quite a bit. It is an umbrella term. That could be a mold remediation contractor, could be an industrial hygienist. It could be a ton of things, but make sure you hire the proper one.
How do people even know who to call when they first suspect a mold issue? I mean, there's all of these franchises, which what would they be considered? Restoration companies?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's mold restoration, there's mold remediation, there's mold mitigation. Like, how do people know which type of company they should be calling?
Well, just to kind of quickly answer that, CNC Contractor Services, we're a mold mitigation company, meaning we only remove the mold. A restoration company is going to remove the mold, restore the home back to its original state.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Now, is a mold restoration company also the mop-up people?
Well, a restoration, I've never heard of the term mold restoration,
Okay.
but it's just a restoration company.
Oh, okay. So restoration company could be from fire. It could be
Fire,
from
flood, crime scene.
mold. And so they're the ones who show up on the scene, mop it up,
Yeah, they're the mop-up.
and then they assess for whatever, and they fix it, and they restore it afterwards.
Exactly.
Okay.
We've talked about this in previous episodes. There are times that, I was working on a state project where they hired me to do the rehab. I call it rehab, putting it back together. But it was in a rural town. I didn't want to do it, but it's that Shoshone project that we've talked about on the podcast. But I guess my point is sometimes we do have to do it. Obviously, being a federal contractor, if I'm in a situation where we have to just do the demo part, the mold removal part, where I could hire subs to do the rehab. But my point is at CNC, we don't come in and do mop-ups. We come in when we know there's a mold issue, and then we remove the mold and we're out of there.
And so I think some people might listen to this and say, is it better to hire somebody who does all of the things from mop-up to restoration, or do I want a mold mitigation firm? I mean, how do people make that decision?
Well, a lot of it just has to deal with, if insurance is involved, how much it's going to cost. As you know, we just did a project last year where they hired a project manager. And as you very well know, we already have our own project manager, and we don't need another one that doesn't know how it's supposed to be done.
Yeah.
So my suggestion to that client was let the project manager manage everything else except for our work. It didn't end up being that way, and it turned into a poop show.
Absolutely.
I guess my point with that is I get it where the client wants to hire a project manager because they hired the contractor that was going to do some other work for them. I get that part. You've got to get electricians involved, plumbers, tile companies, all sorts of stuff. But when it comes to the mold removal part, and obviously I'm a little bit biased, let the mold expert take care of their project. Let them manage their project. To go back to your question, most of the time, and that's why the restoration companies do everything, it's a one-stop shop kind of thing.
Okay. But I guess what I'm really asking, because I'm thinking about somebody who's listening to this, how do you know who's good and how do you know who's not good and who you should hire? Okay. That's the tricky, that's why people spend so much money before they get to you. But how can they avoid that if possible?
Well, we do have an email opt-in that says hiring your mold contractor. It's just a single sheet PDF, pretty simple. But to answer your question fairly quickly, they need to hire somebody that's obviously certified. And for our listeners, most states do not regulate our business. Florida, Texas, I think Illinois is going to start.
And New York, right?
Yep, and New York. They're the only states that regulate our business, or our industry. But you got to make sure that they're certified. Even if they don't have to be, make sure they're certified.
Okay.
We see it all the time in the Utah groups.
Yeah.
You can tell this person just literally went and bought a franchise, and now they're a restoration company, and now they think they're mold experts.
Correct.
Also, make sure they're insured. Ask them what standards do they perform mold remediation to. They should do it to IICRC S520 standards.
Okay.
For our listeners, that's pretty much, in my opinion, the only or the best standards out there for mold remediation. I think they're the only ones. Before I was even aware of that, at CNC, we went over and above what their standards are anyways.
Absolutely. So make sure that they're certified and insured. They do follow the IICRC S520 standards. What else?
Get a couple of bids at least. And lastly, I always recommend call the company and get somebody on the phone. Now, keep in mind for our listeners that you're probably going to talk to the person that's certified and understands all the mold.
Mm-hmm.
So they might talk a good game, but I would make sure that they're going to be there on site and they're going to do it to those standards. If you ask them questions, for our listeners, they've listened, maybe it's the first time they're listening, but they can go listen to other episodes, and we talk about it all the time, what to ask that potential contractor. Because if they don't know what mycotoxins are, if they don't understand the health ramifications of mold exposure, you probably shouldn't hire them.
Totally agree. So what happens if somebody feels like they did all their due diligence, they feel like they hired a reputable firm, and for whatever reason, the mold job is taking months longer than was promised, it still isn't done, and the work, at least to the person, looks pretty mediocre? What in that situation where they're like, possession is 9/10 of the law, they're possessing your property, they're taking much longer, you don't really know what's going on because not much looks different. What do you do?
Well, I want to backtrack just a little bit that I didn't mention. I mean, I mentioned it, but I didn't really mention it as far as picking your contractor. Make sure you sign a scope of work or a contract.
Okay.
Because in that contract, it should be specific. The mold remediation is going to take 2 weeks. The cool down period is going to take how many ever days. The rehab, whatever the scope of work is, should all be lined out before you actually hire them.
So I'm assuming if somebody is listening to this episode and they've hired somebody to do mold mitigation or remediation for them and there was no scope of work, that alone should be a red flag.
Oh, big time.
Okay.
A bid, once again, I've dealt with this. I do it all the time. The bid is not, unless you're signing it, it's not an official scope of work.
Okay.
But if you don't even have that kind of information in a bid or estimate, whatever verbiage you want to use, that's a major red flag. Because how do you, as the homeowner, how do you hold a contractor liable if you have nothing to hold them to?
You don't.
Yeah. And so it's very important. But to answer your question, here's typically what happens, because this is when we typically get involved. I tell my client, depending on the situation, which every situation is unique, I tell them, if they're close to being finished with what their scope of work shows, let them finish up, tell them you're done with them, express your concerns and say, I now have to bring in another contractor that knows what they're doing to finish it. I would try to negotiate with the contractor that's doing it initially, but it's usually best if they can just finish their work that's in their scope of work. Leave the containments up, which they better have up. That's a major issue. If they don't, have them leave the floor protection down. Then we can come in, or another contractor that you trust in your local area, then they can come in and finish it properly.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think some people might be concerned of, they have possession of my house. If I tell them I'm going to bring somebody new, am I concerned that they're going to create more problems? What do you say to that before they leave?
Well, there's not, that's, at that point, I would tell them to get their lawyers involved, honestly. Because, I'm not asking our listeners to be dishonest with the current contractor, but on the other hand, it's in their best interest to just say, hey, this is all we can afford. We're not going to pay for all these change orders. Don't tell them you're going to hire another contractor. Just say, we'll deal with it.
Okay.
And, I think that would be the best way, because once again, every situation's unique. And if you have a contractor that got a temper and they're going to freak out, it's probably best to just say, hey, we get it. You want to do more work, but we're not willing to pay more money. So finish what you were contracted to do and then we'll deal with it.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That's probably not the answer most of the listeners want to hear, but I know for me, as the owner of the company, I'm very clear with my client. Like, I'm not going to get in the middle of this. Let them wrap up their work. We'll come in and do our work.
Absolutely. So what's your call to action for people?
So we mentioned it, before you hire your contractor, make sure you call them and ask questions, like we talked about earlier.
And make sure they can actually answer the questions well.
Like I said, if it's the guy with all the certifications or gal that answers all your questions, I would make sure they're on site to verify it's being done that way.
Absolutely.
So we talked about it at the beginning of the podcast. We have a Thinkific course that we're going to have ready pretty quickly. Can you just explain to our listeners like how, and we'll put the course link in there, but just explain to them how they can take that course.
Absolutely. So Steve has created a course called Toxic Mold Sickness and IAQ, Indoor Air Quality, and it's a great, quick, but really educational course that's going to help you understand how you navigate. Is this mold sickness? Is this mold toxicity? What is this? What are the symptoms? How can I document the symptoms? How can I bring this to my physician? There's like a physician assessment. There's a self-assessment in there. You just have everything you need to really understand toxic mold sickness and to document your experience with toxic mold sickness so you can put together your mold support team.
Wow. You said it better than I could. Like you said, there's a mold sickness journal. There's a resource guide.
Mold symptoms tracker guide. There's so much in there for the price. And so what will happen is you'll have the link in the comments of this
in the
episode,
description.
In the description, and you just click it, you pay for the course, you get enrolled immediately. So you could actually start this course today.
Perfect. All right. You said it very well. Like I said, better than I could have. So we appreciate all you listeners. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.